There has to be, and I'm an optimist. I just really believe that both sides are, the faster they fall into the abyss and mutually behaving badly, the seeds of the middle grow. And the middle, as I've made clear, is not about simply being in the middle because you don't want to take a position. It's in framing every conflict, every disagreement with the underlying context that we're seeking resolution. We're not seeking to hate each other.
Yeah, we're seeking to actually unify. We need to unify behind the best ideas and the best leaders. And we have a system that doesn't allow us to do that, which is why we're both working so hard. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Independent Voter Podcast. This is Cara McCormick. I'm here with the illustrious Steve Peace, former state senator from the state of California, former director of finance, and California maverick who authored the top 2 legislation that is being used today in California. Actually, since what year has that been being used, Steve? Welcome to the show.
Oh, you're going to give me the hard questions, right? I think it was 2010. I think it was 2010 we passed it.
That makes sense. And I don't know if you were able to watch the governor's race debate last night, but 1 in 4 Californians are still undecided about this governor's race. And the ballots, I think they're getting mailed out 1 week from today. So did you have a chance to watch that debate?
I did. And it is of little surprise that you have by historical norms, a disproportionate undecided. These are the voters that are not automatically snapping to the most polarized partisan rhetoric on either side, and they're looking for a candidate to embrace a narrative that is about governance as opposed to trading barbs at each other.
That makes sense. So there was like 8 candidates, I think, last night that made the debate stage. It was at Pomona College. Got 6 Dems. We've got 2 Republicans, right? Bianco said the whole thing was like the Twilight Zone to him. He said, this is the hour and a half that you're not going to get back. But, I didn't think it was as bad as that. Katie Porter at one point slammed her head into her hands and said, this is worse than my teenagers at dinner. But I didn't really think it was a mess. I thought that Becerra had one of the best sound bites of the night, but it kind of goes to what you're saying, Steve, about how, it's not necessarily that Donald Trump is to blame for all of California's problems, as the Democrats might want you to think. And it's not necessarily that 16 years of Democratic rule is responsible for all the problems, as the Republicans would want to have you think. It's something else, right?
Well, and not only that, there are things that could have been even worse, but for reforms like the Independent Redistricting Commission, which ironically we temporarily repealed, as well as the nonpartisan primary reform. We have a far more centric, overwhelmingly Democratic, but more centric Democratic legislature than we otherwise would in a partisan environment. And look, we can go back and trace to the history and each of the issues that have made California affordable. And that's really the fundamental debate that Republicans are squaring up, saying, look, California is unaffordable. And the reason it's unaffordable is a series of Democratic decisions. Now, let's go back and skip over the fact that you had a Republican governor for 8 years in Arnold Schwarzenegger during the period of time when a lot of these policies were embraced. But it's really not about being Republican or Democrat. It has its roots going back 30, 40 years ago, even before I was elected and then left the legislature 20 years ago, when in a variety of public policy environments, we began down a path of embracing policies, which ironically were often driven by the public even more than the legislature. Mm-hmm. And we can circle back to that when we get through some of these specific discussions about this debate. But as a former Republican minority leader said to me just a few weeks ago, Steve, there no longer is a constituency for governance. And a great deal of what we're seeing more transparently, thanks to the internet, is the degree to which the most hyperbolic rhetoric, the most partisan, fear-based narratives on both sides are rewarded by the political system. And unfortunately, social media takes it to still another point of exaggeration. So what we're really seeing is a bunch of political figures who might be much more reasonable behind the scenes, but they are playing their cartoon selves in order to fit the narratives that are most easily replicated in the most strident environments and where the rhetoric is is the most toxic.
Right. So like last night, for example, Becerra, he said the most memorable line of the night. He said, the first thing we have to do is stop Steve Hilton's daddy, who has endorsed him. Had Trump allowed, and
Right.
he's basically saying that Donald Trump is Steve Hilton's daddy.
Right.
And that we need somebody who's going to fight against Donald Trump and not agree with him. Right. So
Yeah, and look,
it's
Cara, you and
like
I,
distilling Becerra's whole thoughtful
correct.
message down to that.
Right. And you and I have both been in debate preparations for candidates in every election cycle, and you're always seeking for the zinger. You're looking for something that's going to get press coverage and whatnot. The irony is, I think what all these players, to the extent they're chasing the zinger, are actually embracing more of an old school political environment in which the one line out of a debate had a lot more traction than it does today.
Like,
And
where's the beef? Remember that?
right, exactly. And
Yeah.
really that's in these presidential debates, which are the ones we're all the most familiar with, it all was always looking for that one enduring line. You know, what's easy to forget, though, is the fellow who articulated where's the beef. Where did he end up?
He lost, right?
Thank you. I mean,
Yeah.
so winning
That
the
was, it was
debate,
Mondale. Was it Mondale?
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
winning the debate and winning the election are two different things.
For sure.
And often you can lose the room and win the larger conversation that follows the debate, or just the opposite, lose the room, which candidly is a local candidate in in an era where there was tons of debate. We do 15 debates in an election cycle, and I often lost a room because I couldn't resist being a smartass. But more often than not, that excitement and inclination of the press to follow a pithy comment, right?
Yeah.
In that era, where the definition of pith was far more moderate than it is today.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. You got to get way beyond pithy these days to get any attention. It's just part of the problem.
Right. Another big moment was like when Steve Hilton did go sort of back after Becerra on his. Becerra basically proposed to declare a state of emergency to freeze the homeowners' insurance rates in California. And I guess that Hilton said, held up the statute and like waved it at Becerra
Right.
on the stage. Have you read this statute? We can't have a governor who doesn't understand how the government works.
Right. And candidly, I mean, Hilton was correct, but he was even more correct than he articulated. In California, we have an elected insurance commissioner. And that's an ironic reality of how the regulatory process for insurance across the board, fire insurance, liability insurance, auto insurance, and whatnot work, everything except health insurance. And the history of that is demonstrative of the point I made earlier, where a lot of this, we as Californians got to look at ourselves in the mirror. How do we get this regulatory environment? It was put on the ballot. The voters put it together. It was an initiative that was done by an organization, interestingly called Consumer Watchdogs. But Consumer Watchdogs still exist to this day. They're really a law firm, and they have made hundreds of millions of dollars in intervener fees. Right, hundreds of millions of dollars in intervener fees and other elements working within the system they wrote and they invented. It was a system written by plaintiff attorneys for plaintiff attorneys and voted on not by the legislature, but by the people. And so this is what.
Are you saying that the people are responsible for their own affordability crisis in California?
We can get, just like anybody else, representative government, the whole concept of representative government is I'm going to elect somebody to go up there and get into the depths of the various issues and do the best job they can of trying to represent what I think is a good thing to do. But if I didn't want to defer some judgment to somebody that I elect, then we might as well just have, direct democracy. We get up every morning and vote on everything on the internet. Maybe someday, that's what we're going to do. But I, in an era, you would like to think, and this is true in some cases and untrue in other cases, but that somebody that takes on the responsibility to be a representative would do the due diligence to understand all the different sides of the issue, listen to the advocates, listen to the opponents, and try to be an adjudicator. I used to joke that
would be great, right? That would be really great.
Well, that's the job. That is the job.
That is the job. You're right.
So, and I used to joke and say, look, the problem with the back and forth of American government is that Democrats get in charge and they feel that they have to put on one of the uniforms of one of the teams and play the game. And so eventually they lose power and the Republicans get in charge. And they just take the referees off and leave the field and let the players go at it, and there's no rules. And
Right.
now we have in the American narrative something that didn't occur in my era, which is an overt argument. Not only it's interesting because it's a natural reaction on the extreme to the degree to which the movement on the right got so much traction that led to things like deregulation of the utility industry and whatnot, where we had this overt articulation of laissez-faire capitalism, the most brutal, unregulated capitalism with no oversight, a limited amount of rules, arguments against things even at like minimum wage, child labor laws, that sort of thing. So now we see an overt articulation of the other side of the extreme,
That's right.
which is to have no game. What do I mean by no game? The referee
Socialism, right?
The referee is the player. The referee is the team. The referee is the reserve. The referee is the judge. The referee is the jury. He's their executioner. And as my wife often says over and over again, is power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It doesn't matter who you give unfettered, non-competitive power to, it will ultimately lead to corruption. And I think part of the articulation...
She's right about that, too.
She's right. And look, this is at the root of the Republican narrative in California.
Okay.
And part of what I think Democrats' challenge is to not reflexively defend the undefensible. Because the truth
that would be a change, though.
We have a serious corruption problem in this state.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying there aren't corruption problems over, but the impulse in this polarized Republican versus Democrat narrative is to simply react. They said A, therefore I say A is wrong, as opposed to embracing that ground in the middle. Say, well, wait a minute. A's right, but let's get down to the reasons why A is right and how do we fix it? And I believe there's more constituency, and you see it in the 25%. We just spoke to. That's the constituency that's looking for people who are willing to and resist. You heard the moderators force the candidates to give yes/no answers. Now let's step back for a minute.
Yeah.
Is anything in the world
every
really
candidate
yes,
was
no?
asked point blank, yes or no? Should the gas tax be frozen?
It's absurd.
Right. Yes or no?
These are absurd grammar school questions. Back when I used to spend a lot of time when I was in our office in schools, including grammar schools, talking about the system and how it works, one of the things I would say is that, look, it'd be great for life to be a yes/no question or even multiple choice. But the real world is every question is essay. And however the world
and all
formed,
of the above,
right? Whatever your broader philosophical, cultural beliefs are, or religious beliefs or non-religious beliefs are, the world was delivered to us with complexity. And if we demand that our representatives and the people who are developing our social rules and the way we interact with each other in the workplace or otherwise, if we demand that they dumb down their answers into cartoon, ridiculous yeses and nos, or even A, B, or C's, because those aren't the answers either. All we're doing is capitulating to a downward spiral in which democracy can't survive. We have all this narrative.
So in that respect, though, like debates are wonderful, right? But maybe debates where they say yes or no. I mean, to me, I love it when a politician can just say yes or no to certain things. I have to say, where it's not like some hedge, if this, then that. But,
right.
so
because
like when Mahan said yes, I was like, wow, a Democrat who wants to.
The other side of because the other side of the argument is politicians obfuscate. They seek to avoid answering questions. But there's ways to vote. Let me give you an example of where Mahan refused. He was the only Democrat when asked, would you support prosecuting ICE officers, right? And that's the way the question was asked. It wasn't asked, would you support prosecuting ICE officers that break the law, right? The implication of the question was, do you support ICE officers who are out doing their job according to the federal rules, right?
Yeah.
Each of the Democrats said yes. Each of the Democrats said no, capitulating to the moderator's demand that they say yes or no, which I never would have done in a million years. I'd have taken that on in a minute, and I'd have flipped it on the moderator there. I said, "Are you really that sophomoric? Is that where we're at?" But Mahan did an interesting thing. He said yes if they broke the law.
Right. Yeah.
Now
He seems more nuanced than a bunch of these,
well, I
you know.
don't like the word nuance because it implies avoiding.
Sorry.
That's a legitimate
Thoughtful.
qualification. It's a more complete answer because the
Yeah.
truth is, even Javier Becerra, who I know very well,
Mm-hmm.
who would appear in his answer to say yes, to be boldly saying yes, Javier's a former attorney general and
Mm-hmm.
a prosecutor. He knows perfectly well what, in his mind, he's keeping to himself because he wants the answer to be unequivocal and feel strong and bold. But he knows darn well there are circumstances in which the law has been broken and circumstances in which the law hasn't been broken. And the law has always been that if a officer, federal, state, or otherwise, exceeds their authority, breaks their law, does something that is illegal, they'll be prosecuted. There's never been any barrier to that prosecution. So that was a question
Yes.
that literally meant nothing in the real world of governments, will have no consequence whatsoever going forward, but it's a hot button question for the moment.
Right. Yep. Yep. So Katie Porter, I thought she was pretty well. She's just very well spoken, I think.
She's very articulate and
yes.
she listens. Interesting. One of the things she does
Yes.
really well is she listens. And as a consequence of listening, in a debate, but my mother was a debate teacher, so forgive me if I sound
no kidding.
too anything. So the most important thing you get taught in learning is that don't start by running your mouth, start by opening your ears. You can't debate an opponent unless you've heard what they've said. And if you listen carefully, 90% of what you say is going to come from your careful listening because your ammunition is going to be given to you by your opponent. Katie Porter's
And that's
very good at
exactly
that.
what she did when she went after Steyer. She was like, this guy who spent $143 million of his own money on this race, and he's sitting up there talking about, making polluters pay. And she just said, so they were causing great damage while you were investing in them? How about profiteers pay? You pay the lowest tax rate on this whole stage, and yet you made the billions that you're using to fund your campaign off of fossil fuels. He tried to push back, but it was just like, whoa,
Right.
Katie.
And that was a moment.
And she got that because she was listening.
She was listening, and it was also a moment where the moderators let it go. The most important thing, and you see this mistake made mostly in these national presidential debates, where the egos of the moderators are so big that they're trying to score a point. They're trying to get elected president. They think they're going to get written in, right? If they score a big score,
right?
And you listen, and you go through these debates, and if you went back and clocked the time spent, they literally have more time by the moderators articulating their long-winded questions, and then they demand that the candidate answer yes or no. I mean, it's hilarious. I mean, you think these reporters, they're so full of their own ego. They spend a book writing their question, then say, now answer yes or no. and yet, that's not who we want to hear from. Give the moderator credit there, where they let that back and forth happen. And if we had more debates, and people want the discipline, and these people can get out of control and they yell at each other, and this happens and whatnot. But the reality is, you want to see the authenticity of that. How do they handle that pressure?
Yeah, totally.
And that's what a real debate. The debate's supposed to be between the candidates, not between a candidate and a moderator.
Right. So last night, it seemed to me like that everyone on the stage seems to, varying degrees or the other, to have adopted this abundance mindset. That's like being championed by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. It's in their book by the same name, and it's basically like a build, baby, build. We need to have abundance. We need to have, we're going to solve our housing crisis by building more without all this regulation. It's so interesting to me that you have all these Democrats who've now become, I guess, YIMBYs. Is that what they're called?
Yeah. So we can trace back to the current discussion is the real estate business. Before that, it was energy business. And before that, it was the insurance business. And I just articulated
They're all
a few
three
moments
places
ago.
where we have a very expensive cost of living, right?
And in each case, the voters were told, here's a solution that's coming from consumer side interest and something in the political spectrum, we probably say the left. But and we've already spoken a little bit about how did it happen in the insurance industry. Well, in that case, it was the lawyers who had a financial interest in changing the rules so that they would benefit, that represented themselves as consumer folk.
Against the environmentalists or?
All the above. Look, what happens is you have multiple interests in any political exercise that build coalitions and move forward. And at the end of the day, some, if not most of these people are genuinely intended. And they genuinely see problems. They genuinely want to fix them. But in order to articulate a position and to win over, whether it's a legislative effort or a effort at the ballot box, requires money. And at the end of the day, there's always
a lot of money
way back in the background, sometimes never seen. All the money is not reported in the form of political contributions.
Nope.
The money finds itself being visited into contributions to nonprofit groups and payment of lawyers to draft legislation. We can talk about the wealth tax in a little bit, and little zingers that are buried in the wealth tax that are blatantly hilarious when you look at them and such. But there's always a moneyed interest. I shouldn't say always, because by definition, nothing is ever always. But 99 and 9/10% of the time, the engine that drives something is money. And
money, and then the agenda.
Yeah, but see, what often happens is the folks in the agenda think they take the money because that's where they can get it. And look, there's a whole lineage of Steyer's involvement in politics is connected to this whole phenomena of money pushing agendas and reframing agendas in language that's appealing to consumer folks and
which is kind of what's happening with this abundance movement, right?
Correct. I mean, but before we get to abundance, that's the current moment. But we went from insurance, where the thing, then we went into the energy world, where all over the nation, this whole nation of this whole notion of competitive delivery, most brilliantly articulated only privately and discovered after the lawsuits by an Enron trader saying, "I want to sell to grandma," which is what the real agenda was. Take these large wholesale seller interests, allow them to sell direct into the retail space where you have low knowledge consumers, and many of them, right? And that was the real agenda. But they sold the consumer groups who were afraid that big energy customers would get, quote, the benefit of competition, and small energy customers wouldn't. And they were so accustomed to fighting the, quote, utilities, the big bad regulated utilities, they became easy prey by the most voracious capitalists on the planet, traders, derivative traders, which is really where all this money was being made. And they literally used that left bias against regulated utilities to push to
get their own way. To manipulate the people who normally
and you were
would
in an environment where you had a unanimous Public Utilities Commission reported by a Republican governor who legitimately believed in a laissez-faire competition environment, right? So now you have, ironically, Steyer running commercials saying, "I'm going to break up the utilities." Okay, the problem on energy costs in California.
They probably don't like that very much.
Right. Well, but it's popular. You always want to break up the utilities, but
right.
Who doesn't want to break up the utilities? Who likes their utility bill?
Got it. Yep.
But that's irrelevant. But the question is, what's the risk to consumers, and what do you really articulate? There's only two choices. You either go to public ownership of everything, so you eliminate private ownership, or you go to pure competition. And he's been vague about what he's pitching. Is he pitching Enron too? Or is he pitching public ownership? Well, let's assume bad things happen in the marketplace. When you're totally in public ownership, that means taxpayers pick up the bill. But if you're in a competitive environment,
they pick up the bill?
No, let me finish.
Yeah.
If you're in a private sector competitive environment, the consumers pick up the bill. If there's no regulator, there's nobody looking over them, right? The only place where you can reach back, just as we did here, $6 billion when California was attacked by Enron and traders. Ultimately, the courts found that the FERC federal regulators didn't do their job. These guys cheated. They broke the rules, and they let about $12 billion go over the transom. But $6 billion of that was recovered and restored to ratepayers. Of the $6 billion that wasn't recovered, stockholders had to take the hit through bankruptcy proceedings, and debt holders had to take a hit. Then portion of that hit was passed on to ratepayers. But hey, you've been
so a portion of that second hit was
about
passed
20
on
to 25%. So if you'd have been in either a total public environment, or as we were in San Diego, because SDG&E was already outside of the regulatory brand, where consumers took the whole hit. We got destroyed, and we had businesses shut down. That didn't happen in PG&E and Edison territory because the regulator captured and forced the pain on the utilities while the legal battles were fought. I don't think the PUC did a good job. They should have also ordered the utilities don't pay the bills. And the utilities should have defied their obligation under the regulatory cabinet and just refused to pay the bill. And then that money would have been escrowed. And when we won the lawsuits, all the money would have come back, right? But again, imperfect regulators, just like the regulators at the time prohibited the IOUs, the investor-owned utilities, from hedging, which made them vulnerable to the attack in the first place. Batshit stupid. Okay, but
to the other traders, basically, is that
no? Because that's what they thought. They were so absorbed. Both the right and the left were so absorbed with the idea the utilities were the bad guy. They built all these rules to make sure the utilities couldn't use their quote monopolistic power to prevent the competition from emerging. Those are the guys on the right, to protect the consumers, the folks on the left. And the net result was they didn't let the utilities do basic tools of spreading the risk between long-term purchases and short-term purchases. And they were exposed entirely to the short-term market, whereas the public utilities who were not subject to regulation weren't. So they didn't get the short-term hit, but ultimately everybody buys out of the same wholesale market. Right. And the delusion that somehow private utility ratepayers were different than the publicly ones is just craziness. In the end, the problem was, going back to your core question, we didn't put solar units on homes. We didn't put whatever it is, nuclear, coal, have your debate about what your sources are going to be. But we became dependent on a transmission system and the generation of power from out of the state. And
so
that
where
put
does
the
it all
suppliers
come from,
in
the
control.
Power?
Comes from Utah, and it comes from Nevada, and it comes from Arizona.
So it's like it creates this dependence.
We're totally dependent on the outside. We're vulnerable. And what's the other correlate when we get to the insurance question? Well, where do we trace most of our or at least a large component of our problem as it relates to wildfires and home burning down? Transmission lines. So we as Californians have got to embrace the reality. And I remember 30 years trying to make this argument. There's nobody in the room. Nobody agreed. I said, guys, why are we building all this? Why are we having all this dependency? And it was because, and me too, nobody wants a power plant in their backyard. The great thing is technological advances are such that between solar and modern small pack nuclear and whatnot, we're probably going to see a return of people looking more seriously at generating power near to source and near to where you actually have to deliver and use the power. But there's a huge industry now built around the transmission industry.
Around the lines, for sure. That's going on.
When Steyer talks about cutting bills, utilities don't even buy electricity anymore. They just pass it through. It's bought through other public entities. The only thing the utilities are doing is managing the distribution systems and the transmission systems. And so here you have an example of where a candidate embraces a narrative, not because he has a real solution. He gets two great benefits out of it. One, he gets to say, I'm going to reduce your costs. I'm just going to cut it by 25%. And two, I'm going to do it by beating up people are the bad guys, utilities.
Totally. Okay.
Right? It's all BS, and he knows it's BS.
This is the formula that they're all seem to be using, right? It really is.
So you wanted to go to the housing industry in the YIMBY. So now for the last about 10 years, the same traders, the exact same guys, the same guys that exploited and blew up the California energy market, cheated, they're now busy buying up real estate all over California. San Diego specifically has the highest, the same guys. This is it's all wholesale money.
Okay.
And it's about land values. It's not about home values, it's about land values. If you can deregulate the housing industry, right? And that, they call it, we got to get rid of zoning, right? You think, what is zoning? It's regulation. If you succeed in deregulating.
It says you can build a 4-story house,
where
but you can't
previously
build an 8-story house.
you used to only be able to
Apartment.
build a single family home. If I buy a bunch of property and I know the rules are going to change, and that property I'm owning, I can suddenly build 6 units or 8 units or 10 units or 50 units. The abundance narrative, right? And I'm going to use the left's desire to see higher density development and less dependency on automobiles and whatnot.
Cheaper rent
Correct.
and
And all these
cheaper
things.
mortgages,
Well,
affordability, right?
that's
Because we
the
need to have
pitch.
more supply is the idea.
But what happens when I'm the guy with all the capital and I don't need to borrow money? I'm buying homes for cash and I'm hanging on to that property. It's just like buying Monopoly. The only difference is in Monopoly, at least you buy the cheaper properties and it's then cheaper to do the hotels and whatnot. In this
Right.
Monopoly game, they can buy up all these pieces of property wherever, and it can be Park Place. It doesn't matter. You don't need to get, a whole block thing. And then boom, overnight you're building apartments, right? The underlying land value goes crazy. The guys that buy they're not developers. They're not going to develop anything. They're going to flip the property. This is all a big scam. It's all about flipping. It's not about being a developer. Now,
Just like it's like trading is not about investing.
Correct.
Right?
And
so you're trading
right,
in the market,
right.
but you're not
Correct.
investing in a company to build it for the long term. You're not investing
Right.
in a community to build it
And
for the
look,
long term necessarily.
As a community, as a country, as a culture, we're slowly slipping into this away from investing to building relationships and businesses and communities to trading and then to gambling. You look at the most, right here in San Diego, we just had a baseball team bought for $3.9 billion. There is no way to amortize this small market team and its current payroll or anything based on $3.9 billion. It's not coincidental that Clear Lake, that is Associate Purchase, good, legitimate company, but they're also amongst the best, most engaged entities in financing gambling operation, online gambling. Sports has become gambling in this country.
They've come together.
Correct.
And it's all because of our politics.
And we just saw 2 weeks ago, the revelation that one of the soldiers involved in going into Venezuela was involved in gambling. We saw just last week, one of the Indiana quarterbacks that moved over, got a $5 million deal to go to Texas Tech. His contract's now in question because he'd been gambling last year on Indiana, right?
Yeah.
This is a torturously, you want to talk about a wealth tax, the best way to get a wealth tax, the most regressive tax on the planet is gambling. The participation in gambling amongst lower income people is exponential. Then you look at the amount of money that is lost and stolen from working people, right? And retired people from gambling. It dwarfs any of the numbers we're talking about in terms of tax structures. You want to do the single most valuable thing you can do to protect consumers and people's pocketbooks, regulate. Do we see a theme here? Regulate that gambling environment. I'm not naive enough to believe that we just make it illegal. We went through prohibition. We're going through a transition we're going through a transition in cannabis on the same thing.
Yes.
You can't just ban your way into forcing people into, quote, good behavior, but you can mitigate.
You're going to force people into bad behavior because they're going to be then breaking the law.
You can mitigate, right? You can educate, and at least you can police. You can police the people who are providing the products or services and have consequences for the people who cheat. And that's government's job. Government's job isn't to provide the service. It's to make sure that these services are provided legitimately. And when people cheat, they're caught and punished.
It feels like we're living in a political system right now that can only give one answer or say that answer is the wrong answer. Like, we can't iterate. It just seems like there's answers coming from sort of the far left and answers coming from sort of the far right. And we're swinging back and forth between these two extremes. And there's no iteration and there's no great ideas coming to the fore because everybody's sort of locked into these two warring camps.
Right.
And,
so why, to your point, why aren't we talking about 4-day work week and the interface between the AI? We should have been talking about 4-day work week.
That's brilliant.
35, 40 years ago. And our debate now should be about 3-day work week, okay? And
because we have
that's
AI,
how far behind.
Right?
But the reason for that is partisanship.
Yeah.
End of story. And the reason why abolishing partisan primaries is literally existential in terms of you want democracy to survive in a more transparent world where the internet makes the interaction of public policy far more public than it has ever been before. Remember the old adage, never watch sausage or politics being made, right? Well, there's no longer a sausage factory that can't be seen, and there's no longer a private political negotiation that is not seen. And
you think?
And the reality is,
like eventually seen. You think there's no more private political negotiations, like backroom deals, smoke-filled rooms? It's all gone.
Look, it's there was never a debate about transparency. There's always been the presumption that transparency is always better, and it's just not true. Imagine if you were a labor negotiator, right? You're sitting at the table, and all your labor union members are looking over your shoulder, just in a podcast environment, just as we are today, and you agree to anything that the business guy proposes. You're going to be out in 20 seconds, and there'll be a new negotiator there. The reality is, what used to happen in a less transparent cultural environment is, however toxic the battles between Republicans and Democrats appeared to be publicly, the personal relationships were far better privately than they let the public know.
Do you think that's gone?
Yes.
Interesting.
And it's gone because they can't. And they can't because they all have to face primaries. If they face primaries, the mere fact that they were civil to if a Democrat was civil to a Republican or similarly, the Republican was civil to a Democrat, would literally be used against them in a primary election, which not only is just Republicans or just Democrats. It's worse than that. It's 20 or 30% of the Republicans that are the Democrats.
Right.
So what we're doing is we're selecting nominees with less than 10% of voters determining who the nominees are. Let that sink in. You start doing the math. That typical nominee is selected with less than 10% of the voters. So why does it surprise you when you get to the general election, even if it is a district in which the underlying numbers are redistricted competitively, the two candidates have been selected by the smallest proportion of voters from each party. And incidentally, independents in most states haven't participated at all.
Not at all, because it's closed, right? It's a closed
primary. Why does it shock you when you end up with an unacceptable Democrat and an unacceptable Republican? So look.
And then, like with combined negatives of 120%.
Correct. And they've each spent the campaign time leading up to that, beating up to each other. And that becomes the narrative. Fear drives the world, whether it's politics, selling products, whatever it is.
Wait, it's fear and not love? Are you telling me that?
Even the fear of love is a powerful motivation. So at the end of the day, people will default to negativity. And you have to begin to think actively about how you construct political structures in a very public environment. Great thing about the internet, it does make things. And I think in the long run, the transparency brought to us by the internet is going to be a good thing. But we're going through a difficult transitionary period. How to meld our political systems. And fundamental to make the internet heighten its positive characteristics is changing our political systems to absolutely abandon partisan primaries, period, end of sentence, and to embrace top 4 and top 5 systems like they have in Alaska. Voters are given more choices when the most people vote. You can't let these elections be defaulted in the primary where you have very low voter participation.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Particularly since you're the author of Top 2, it really does make sense to expand Top 2 to include more, 4 or 5 candidates that make it through to the general. But let's talk for a little second about how, number one, they keep calling this Top 2 primary the jungle primary, which, to me, that's it's like something that I think it first got called that in Louisiana, and I think it's racist. Is that right?
Look, California does not have a jungle primary.
Okay,
I'm not going to blame the reporters who just get fed the term by political operatives, and the
political operatives are feeding right now
because they want to repeal. They want to repeal open primary. It's just that simple. Let's give it a name that sounds bad. Now, where do they get what's the etymology of the term jungle primary? The only state in the union that had a jungle primary was Louisiana. A jungle primary is a primary in which you have multiple candidates in the general election, the November general election, and then you have a runoff after that if nobody gets 50%. So what you end up with is the
So
worst of
November,
all worlds.
December.
Correct. You're having an election at a bad time of the year, number one. And number two, it in effect is a special election. And the turnout's even lower than they typically are in primary elections. It's the world's worst system. Now, to Louisiana's credit, they have gotten rid of it. There are no jungle primaries in the United States. Now, you got, and it's not accidental that you see the more, NPR and most recently Bay Area paper, papers where Democrats have access to, peddling this notion. It happens every cycle this time because just like Donald Trump hates Alaska, top 4, far left, folks hate Alaska, top 4. And why?
I mean, any kind of reform I've ever tried to do, right? It's for sure that the Democrats and the Republicans, the ones in leadership, are against it. They're not reformers. They exist,
even putting aside, I don't want to be pejorative in saying people aren't reform. People have their own view of the world. If you sincerely believe, as these folks, if you don't really believe that their vision of the universe is so superior that they owe an obligation to humanity to have their vision embraced and to save everybody else from themselves. If you accept that, they're doing the right thing as they see it. But if you see democracy as a place where you bring everybody's visions, everybody's competing ideas, everybody's biases, everybody's economic interest, everybody's social interest, everybody's familial. If it's the place we gather and resolve our differences without killing each other, if that's what you believe democracy is, then we've outlived the usefulness of partisan, political, corporation-controlled primaries, because that's what political organizations, they're corporations. They are political corporations. They have an infrastructure just like any other business. They have mouths to feed. They have businesses that develop around it and an entire ecosystem, exactly, around each of them. So you have this Republican ecosystem and Democrat ecosystem. Now, Trump blew up the Republican ecosystem, and you have a bunch of thousands of former Republican consultants who are men and women without countries. And so that's kind of weird. And look, remember, Trump was a lifetime Democrat who went over and blew up the Republican Party. Right. And many of the narratives and the things about Trump, let's get out of the behavior issues, the language issues, the thing for a moment. Some of these things were today, if you'd have woke me up back in 1980 and told me that a Republican president would be advocating tariffs and Democrats would be opposing tariffs, I would have thought you're smoking funny cigarettes. I mean, there is no more fundamental democratic labor issue than tariffs.
That's right. But now tariffs
it's
are bad
down
because it came from the other side. So an idea isn't allowed to be an idea anymore in our system. It gets co-opted by one side or the other. It's like what's happened with ranked choice voting. It drives me completely crazy that it's been like the partisans have tried to make it a partisan issue when it was always designed to be non-partisan. Like that's the ethos behind getting rid of first past the post.
Look, by definition, democracy never fixes things.
Okay.
By definition, democracy has temporary resolutions and preserves our right to come back and revisit.
To keep iterating, right? Hopefully.
It is the core. It's interesting. The socialists have embraced the term progressives. They are not progressives. They're socialists. And they've
But they don't really, they call themselves DSA or Democratic Socialists of America, but mostly they try not to even use that word.
What is progressivism? Progressivism, it was Republicans in California. It was the whole ballot box access and fighting the railroads was the work of progressive Republicans at the turn of moving from the 19th to the 20th century, over 100 years ago. Those were the progressives. They were Republicans at those times. The notion of embracing progressives.
The progressives, the one at that time that you're talking about that came up with the whole citizen initiative and referendum.
Correct. Yes, exactly right.
And I didn't know it was Republicans. I had no idea.
Right. And it was Republicans. And look, at the end of the day, the notion of progress is that we make progress one step at a time. Is ironically, progressivism was the notion of keep going forward. Don't let your notion, your bias about what the perfect is to get in the way
Be
of
the enemy of
progress.
progress.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you looked at every piece of legislation, every potential change in the context of not did this fit my vision of being perfect, but did it make it better than we are today? Where
Yes.
we're
Is it
at right
moving the
now,
ball forward,
correct.
right? Is it
The
moving the
reason
ball
why,
down the field?
correct. And look, at the end of the day, where we're at right now is really interesting inflection point. Politics is always a trailing indicator. Politics is always behind culture. And when politicians
Totally.
try to go and twist the culture and get out of the culture, they end up losing. The politics always loses. The culture always wins.
Because
So
it's
look at it.
behind, right? It's
Correct,
behind
because
the
it's
8 ball.
always behind.
Yeah.
And sometimes the politicians, they get out ahead of themselves. And this isn't about whether they're right or they're wrong. It has nothing to do. You can look. Let me take the hot button issue that nobody should talk about: trans folks in sports. Okay, forget whether you're right or you're wrong. The political class got way out ahead of the cultural class, of the cultural reality. Okay. So regardless of what's right and wrong, you knew at some point this was going to blow up. Okay. And who knows how it shakes out going forward. Right. But if, again, we're living in a world in which we want to resolve differences peacefully and civilly,
We don't live in that
then,
world, though, Steve. We
well,
don't live in that world.
look, guys, we're a long way from, it's certainly less civil than it was when I was there, by
But
far, but it is a long way from collapsing
doom.
into the way most people in the world live. The
Okay,
truth
good.
is, the world through its history has been dominated by incivility and war and the exercise of power, sometimes just for nothing more than the fact that I'm doing it because I can do it, where power always preceded. Our institutions are designed to mitigate between they inherently start with power and protect those that don't. And it's hard sometimes for those that recognize that fundamental rule to realize that if they blow up the institutions, even when they may be temporarily in the hands of people they philosophically disagree with, they're blowing up their tools.
Yeah.
And so this collapse, what appears to be this collapse of civility, which I would hope is somewhat short term. And what I was about to say is that the good news, I think, here is that we could be on the precipice of turning that corner in the
Yes.
following way. Our culture has been, and our economy is an economy of more choices, right? Do you think anybody's going to go back to 3 television stations?
No.
All right. And I could go through a variety of other elements, whether it's the grocery store, there's more abundance, the types of the word, there's more diversity and difference and whatnot. So only thing that hasn't changed
Our politics.
right. We're still living an arcane, driving a Studebaker and a Ford, right? And as though there are only 2 cars.
Yeah.
And
How is it possible that we can be so dynamic in so many other parts of our lives, but this one's so stuck?
easy,
Like, why is
very
it
easy.
so stuck? Because of
It makes
partisanship.
total sense.
Yeah.
Politics always follows.
Okay. We're just behind.
Those of us who are attempting to get people to focus on the bad incentives built into an old system trying to operate in a new world get dismissed as, quote, reformers and unrealistic and things that voters aren't interested in. And guess what? At the front edge, they're right. Because remember, they're peddling fear. We're peddling hope. And
Totally. We are the light at the end of the tunnel. We are the light at the end of the tunnel.
Right. It's hard for the average voter to say, I'm trying to pay my bills. I'm trying to get a roof on my head. I got all these, whatever things I got to pay for today. And you want me to talk about how elections go? Who cares? But what we have to do, and what our challenge is to say, look, you're feeling, part of why you feel disenfranchised, disempowered, and not able to compel the politicians to be responsible to your needs is because the system's out of sync with your life. And we just haven't made the changes. And look, this is the same argument. Ironically, I just made my argument an hour ago for not being so quick to throw the baby out with the bathwater in our look at utilities and regulation. And the truth is, there's regulation on every kind of business articulated in the form of rules. There's work rules. There's this and that. There's some kind of.
Sometimes the regulation is the work. Almost, it feels like when
there's
you're
always
operating.
But I'm going to say something too, that we all know, that the more regulated a entity is, the more protected it is in staying in the old course. And therefore, that's the argument and the things people worry about. There's not enough innovation. Well, the most protected business in our culture is the political business.
Yeah, the two political parties.
When they get into a court battle, when you get into a court battle over the rules of politics, 99 9/10% of the time, there are lawyers there representing the Republicans, lawyers there representing the Democrats, and they're on the same side. They're not in there fighting each other. They want to preserve the rules as they are, because the rules as they are allow each of them to be kings of their own mountaintop.
100%.
Right. And in this, in their selfish world of their own context, and we all convince ourselves that wherever we are, there's some virtue to it. But at the end of the day, these are all people who have committed themselves to that partisan world, that infrastructure, and their world really is that little bubble. Which is why they often have difficulty seeing that their words are heard differently by people not in politics. I mean, for example, my favorite, and I'll leave you at this one. My favorite one is, over and over again, I hear it just recently, one of the candidates running for governor, saying, I'm saying these things. I'm the moderate. I've been saying I'm the moderate. And I said to him, look, when voters hear the word moderate, you say moderate and you mean it on a philosophical scale, left to right, in the middle. That's not what voters are hearing. Voters hear the word moderate, they think you're a wimp. They don't want somebody who's going to be moderate in the sense of not fighting for things. They want somebody to fight.
That's right. I don't want a moderate at all. Right. I want I want somebody who's got some vim and vigor and willing to take things on.
Right. And I immediately, because of today's environment, you say even the word fight. I'm saying it in old man criteria, right? In my era, when I say fight, it would never have entered my mind that fight might mean physically fight. But today, you say fight, what does it mean? Go to the street, throw rocks at each other and whatnot. I'm intuitively thinking in old man's choice of language, which is, I'm going to go and verbally argue aggressively for the things that I think are important. And then at some point, I'm going to realize I'm not going to get my whole enchilada, that I'm not going to get everything I want. And I'm going to try and figure out when I can get the most what I think is right, and then learn and listen to the other side and see why they disagree with me. Why do they feel differently? And I might even learn something and realize that some of what I think is right isn't right after all. Final work product will be a combination of my learning experience from others and my willingness not to insist on getting everything I want, knowing I'm going to have an opportunity to be back at the table again. Al Gore loses the presidency. I was in the room.
2000.
When, ironically, the same lawyer that later represented Donald Trump and convinced Donald Trump to challenge his presidential election, he's having conniption fit because Al had just given this eloquent speech that we had to give up, even though that he believed and everybody in that room believed that Al Gore won Florida. The Supreme Court had ruled otherwise.
And so for the integrity of this, of the whole experiment.
And Gore says, we'll have another chance. There'll be another election. That's because at the end of the day, we were Americans first, and we believed in the perpetuation of the system. Now, ironically, that then young lawyer later grows up, becomes an older lawyer, and gives the same advice to Donald Trump, which leads to all of what we now call election denying, right? It's the same lawyer. And why did he do it? I haven't spoken to him, haven't seen him since that day. But he was emotionally distraught. Incidentally, very liberal Democrat, right? He was, as a lawyer, upset about the fact that all the work he had done was going to go to naught. And he truly believed he was right. Nobody in the room was trying to tell him he wasn't right. But sometimes life isn't fair. It's something we all teach our kids. You sit there and quit and cry like a baby because something happened to you that wasn't fair. You move on. You're tough. You're tough enough.
Yes, but
and learning
my
curve and
God, I mean,
work
how
again.
hard must that have been, that moment for
It was tough
Vice
for all of
President
us.
Gore? It must have just been
But it was tough.
devastating.
It was tough. It was extremely tough for all of us. But you know what?
Yeah.
That's what a leader does. A
Yeah.
leader,
Yeah.
it helps. Good. I've told you many times. Willie Brown's comment to, 24 brand new legislators, Republican and Democrat alike. You've all now been elected. You're now legislators, but you're of no value to your constituents or to me or to the process or the system if you are not able in the coming months to go back to the people that are your closest friends, the people that got you elected, and tell them no, and tell them they have to accept a compromise. Your job here is not to simply advocate for your friends; it's to bring them to the table, and that I'm not sure anybody's making that speech anymore. Because what I see is blatant cheerleading.
They're saying the opposite, Steve. I'll tell you
Correct.
right now.
It's
They're
all
saying yes
cheerleading.
to all of
It's
their friends.
right.
Like, that's how
It's not legislating, it's cheerleading. And so and then you end up going back to my wife's admonition about
dialing
power.
for dollars, right? And
Correct.
basically
Right. And then go back to my wife's admonition about power and power corrupting absolutely. It doesn't matter whether you have a state that's overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democrat. The lack of competition in that political sphere is going to ultimately create bad things. So why does an open primary in a state whose demographics naturally lead itself to being more broadly represented by one party? Because it forces at least some competition in those elements. So let's look at this governor's race.
Yeah.
There is nobody on the planet who has any political sophistication who believes in this cycle any Republican, whether it's Hilton or anybody else, has any chance of winning in November. Zero. Zilch.
So why
4 years from now? Well, that's the point. But 4 years from now, it might be different. Those demographics may shift. But right now, that's where things are. Okay.
That if there's a Republican and a Democrat that make it through in the top two in November, there's no chance in hell that a Republican's going to beat a Democrat in California.
That's right. A Democrat's gonna win. Okay.
Got it.
Given that, isn't it a more competitive system that allows for the possibility that it might be two Democrats? Now,
of course,
the academics and the
no
reporters,
one's saying that.
They'll all have a fit. They think, so what? Unless you start with a premise that the entire world is based on a Republican view and a Democrat view, this isn't religion, for Christ's sakes. And, it's not Islam versus Christianity. These are human beings. And you have an opportunity. And you saw it, interestingly enough, you saw it in the data. When Swalwell got out of the race, the electorate shifted from being focused on issues to being focused on character. And their instinctive perception of who the higher character candidates began to rise. And incidentally, it's clear the press doesn't understand that because they're still holding debates, not focus on background and whatnot. I'll go back. I think I mentioned to you.
They wouldn't even let them have an opening statement or a closing statement in that debate last night.
So think about this one. Right. It's best articulated by, remember the USC debate that was canceled?
Yep.
I think we said this on the podcast before. I don't know whether it ended up getting aired or not. But the big reason for the outrage was that 4 minority candidates were not included.
Were excluded.
In the debate.
Yeah.
Correct.
Right.
But nobody bothered to make the obvious observation that these 4 candidates were also the 4 most experienced candidates in the race.
Yeah.
That was the most
Becerra,
right.
And Villaraigosa.
So what was happening is they were deselecting people based on polling. Swalwell was going to be in that.
Yeah.
I probably don't need to say anything else. Steyer was going to. These are internet memes. Porter, Swalwell, Steyer. They're not real people. They're internet memes. They're invented creatures for digestion for the internet world. And you have people who
have like real experience rather than just a lot of ads behind them, right?
Exactly.
That's what you're saying. Right. Because they're not,
And Bianco has real experience. Even Hilton has some experiences in another country, but there's some real experience. Steyer has a lot of experience.
I'm going to argue with you about that. Like, what's Hilton's experience exactly?
He was involved in government. I don't know the details of it, but he's at least a thing. And look, and he's more of a media personality than he, in my view, and that's my bias.
Yeah, that's why I thought he was like a Fox News host, kind of like Hegseth.
All I'm saying is that the most egregious examples of invented fame rather than qualification are those folks. And then incidentally, two things can be right at once.
Of
Just
course.
because you're an internet meme doesn't mean you're not the most qualified person, right? You might be
Right.
an internet meme and also be able to demonstrate your qualifications. My
Right.
point is the reason why they elevated to being included in the debates was simply because they were polling well. They
Right.
weren't
So they're polling
polling
well
well.
because of their name recognition was
Correct.
high enough because
They
of the
were
ads that they
polling
bought
well
because
because
they're
right.
internet memes, right?
Correct. They were
Yeah.
polling well based on their internet meme status, not
Right.
their qualifications to be governor. And
Yeah.
so this whole, and you faced this when you were working on presidential debate stuff. What are the criteria you use to, and it's the obsession.
It
Everybody
had
goes,
to
well,
be 15% in
yeah,
5 polls conducted
right,
12
right,
weeks before the election.
right. Everybody's
So
worried about,
nobody
oh,
could ever get there who was
right,
an independent.
we're gonna have too many people on the stage, right?
Yeah. 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 They
And
know
I
they were
get
just afraid of 3, but yeah.
right, and I get that, but there are criteria. There's nothing wrong with using criteria that does not involve polling.
Oh, believe me, we tried to come up with plenty of different possibilities besides polling because the polling is, we were able to prove by looking at hundreds of thousands of polls using Ipsos that the margin of error for an independent at that particular point in time would be enough to exclude him even if he had the 15%. I mean, the whole
Well,
thing was totally
yeah,
rigged, basically
correct,
to make sure that there's only ever one Republican and one
correct,
Democrat on the
right,
stage. That's
right.
all you get.
Right. As you know better than I how rigged the presidential debates were to specifically exclude the possibility of somebody emerging that was not an insider pick by the political parties. And I had the
Totally.
experience of
Yeah.
watching in my party, in the Democratic Party, when Bernie Sanders was running against Hillary Clinton. And
Yeah.
suddenly the Clinton team, we were in a panic over the possibility that Bernie Sanders might actually win the nomination on the first ballot. And the rules in those days did not allow what they called superdelegates, meaning elected officials and others,
Yeah. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
vote in the first round. So,
Yeah.
but the rules also allowed the rules to be amended by
There you
four
go.
votes of the party chairs. And so
Of
the
course.
Clinton
Right.
team
Yes.
went to the party chairs, got
Said
the
amend.
votes to change, right?
Yeah.
But who
Yeah.
was the party chair? Who was the Democratic Party chair who voted no against the Clinton effort to rig? Look, and I was on the Clinton side. So, we rigged
Who
the
was it?
rules. Tulsi Gabbard.
No kidding. Yeah. There you go. That
And
makes
that's the
perfect
real
sense.
story. You
Yeah.
hear all she's a terrorist or whatever.
She's a Russian agent.
Russian. It's all horse shit. It's
Yeah.
total crap.
Yeah.
What she did, she was supporting Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
And her violation, right? And incidentally, viewed equally as negatively from the Republican insiders as the
Yes.
Democrat, because she had agreed to be a Democratic Party chair. Therefore, the insider ethic is you can argue privately behind closed doors, but you all come out unified. It's no different when I was in the legislature. You wouldn't believe the batshit crazy stuff that people say in a private Democratic caucus. I mean, it's just some of the stuff is insane. And some of the stuff is more honest and open. And I'd like to have seen it, but the ethic is you argue in caucus and you come out unified, right?
Yeah.
So you might have a vote that is 22 to 21, but you walk out on that floor and it's 43. And that in turn was someday we'll talk about the old Gang of Five fight where we ended up in a battle with then Speaker Willie Brown, who's, one of my admired human beings on the planet from my perspective and a close personal friend. But we were on opposite political sides. But it was really a philosophical. It wasn't about any of the things the press thought it was about. It was the fundamental view of democracy. Did my responsibility as an elected official create the obligation for me to, in effect, represent only Democrats? Or did I have a responsibility to represent the Republicans and the independents in my district as well? And when I felt that my responsibility to my constituents was in conflict with the responsibility to that partisan interested party,
then you chose your
did
constituents.
I have the option, right, without losing my office and losing my chairmanship? Did I have the option to vote differently? That's all it was about.
Is it still that way?
And
like, do
of course
they
it is.
still
It's
have the
worse.
option? I mean, I know they have the
No,
option.
no, they don't. There
No,
is
what I mean is like they
it's,
have less
it's
of an
worse than
option
ever.
now than when you were in the state Senate, right?
Then Assemblyman Phil Eisenberg and I had a really good debate on this. Phil had good arguments. This isn't a matter that their argument is without merit. But that's the argument the public should see and we should discuss. Their position is basically a position about order and maintaining the ability to run the House. It's more of more about administration, ironically, than it is about ideas. Exactly.
Okay. Interesting.
So, and look, and we all come from different, and incidentally, also part of the problem is this: most legislators in most every legislature and members of Congress represent districts that are overwhelmingly Democrat or overwhelmingly Republican.
I mean, by design,
they have no
right?
chance of ever being defeated in a general election.
Yeah.
And that's why independent reapportionment is important. And we got to keep fighting.
And also why we have to get rid of first past the post and basically expand top 2 to top 4, or top 5. I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about do you think that there's kind of within the Democratic Party, there's a bit of a split right now between the so-called, DSA progressives and the more centrist Democrats, and also then on the Republican side that there's sort of a split between the MAGA Republicans and, I don't know, call them the anti-Trump, the no-Trump Republicans. And so is there really like 4 camps right now of partisans, say? I mean, I know there's still no room for an independent in there, right? There's still no room for somebody who says, I think the Democrats have some good ideas and I think the Republicans have some good ideas, and I'm going to embody the best ideas from both. That still's not allowed in our system, it doesn't seem to me.
I mean, there's obviously splits, and I'm not there anymore, and so there's probably other people that are better qualified to comment on what the status of the battles behind the scenes are. But what I can see from the exterior is a generational element where people are seeing things differently. And like in any generational pass on, there'll be things that are better because of a new generation's viewpoint.
And there's things that are worse, right?
That go back, and then you have to kind of settle that out.
Yeah.
But at its core, look, there are people still in office. I was 15, 20 years younger than most everybody I served with. And there are yet still people in office that I served with in office. Part of this problem is people hanging on too long.
They need to move on and give us the benefit of all of their wisdom and knowledge and stay with it, but they can't.
And think about this. This has
holding
always
on.
been an issue. This has always been an issue, and there's value for people at all. You want to mix, by definition, you want a representative government to be reflective of the ethnicity, the age, and the philosophical diversity as well, just as importantly, perhaps most important. You want all those things.
Yeah.
But it's the power of incumbency and other things by nature allows for the extension of service, disproportionately. And I can remember feeling the same way when I was a young legislator, and there were people told me, when are they going to move on? And that, who knows how much of that was on the personal level, in the battles going back to my leadership battles. It's all we're all the same in that respect. So, but there's a line at the end of the new Attack of the Killer Tomatoes Organic Intelligence, where the Irene, who you learn by the end of the movie, had manipulated the whole environment because it's an old crew that had been protecting the world against tomatoes for years, and it's time for them to move on. And Irene obviously has seen this, but Finletter and some of the other characters, don't see it as soon. And as they're leaving, the Finletter character,
they don't know that she's manipulated.
Correct.
Them to the extent that she has.
At the very end of the movie, Finletter says, "So Irene, exactly when did you decide it was time for us to retire?" And Irene says, "The only thing worse than missing your target is to wait too long to shoot." And that's a lot of what's wrong with our country right now. We have a lot of people. Society moves faster than ever. Politics is moving slower than ever. To your point about battles, it's not just as simple as left-right ideas. The people who are older, who have the positions of power, really don't know how to work in this new internet world and the new ways of fundraising and whatnot. So ironically, they become totally dependent upon young staffers and whatnot, and they're just kind of, gliding through life. And these battles are much more about staff people versus staff people and staff people versus a few members. Many
No
years
kidding.
ago. Oh yeah. There's always been, there's one particular staff person in Sacramento I always called 51. So
and then I'm sure there's that person in the Congress too,
41 actually,
like group of people. Yeah, for sure.
Exactly. And he's still there.
Yeah.
And so there's always, this element, but what's happened is the politics has become so overwhelming, and where there are the small number of races that are competitive, the amount of money it's spent is so absurd.
Yeah.
And
that turns people off too,
The campaigns have been so polarized and nationalized that the politicians themselves don't know as much about campaigning or the mechanics of getting elected as they used to. It's all outsourced. You have professional treasurers, professional campaigns. Everything's run by a professional class, right?
Yeah.
You can't even run for office in California unless you hire a certified treasurer. So, it's ridiculous. I mean, the whole idea of citizen government, the notion I see something in the paper, by gosh, I'm going to run for the school board. I'm going to run for a city council seat. I'm going to run for well, by the time you go to run, the filing period is passed, because whereas in the past we used to be highly publicized, today it's just the opposite. They've rigged the filing periods so that the public in general doesn't even know that it's time to run for office. And they've already picked all their candidates.
Right. That's really, we talk about that a lot on the Independent Voter podcast, about how politicians are going to use whatever power is available to them. That's just what they are going to do reflexively. That's like why gerrymandering, the independent redistricting got overturned through Prop 50 in California. It's because that was available on the table, right? And Gavin Newsom said, "Oh, I've got that option on the table.
Correct.
I'm going to use it." They use their power. They not only have it and they use it.
So the Republicans started by doing
Texas,
what I believe a bad thing. I don't think you should have midterm reapportionments. Period.
Of course not.
End of story.
It's terrible.
And I think we made those comments about that effort when they started.
Oh yeah, we're totally on the record.
Then what's Gavin do? And they put their hand over their heart. Oh, we have to. Well, look, let's think about what they did. It isn't just that they put a repeal that was deceptively worded in front of the public. They did it in a special election where they knew the turnout was going to be very small. And then they ran the election. It didn't speak about the terms of the agreement. All they did is ran against Donald Trump and against one of the major funders, on the other side.
And it worked. It totally worked.
Of course it worked. Of course it totally worked. And you could see coming ahead it was going to work. The mystery to me is why the Republicans started this fight in the first place. I thought it was
they did not. They misread.
Totally. But it doesn't matter, because here's what we can leave it with. All of these efforts on both sides is proof positive that neither of these fighting political parties are interested in persuading voters, right? They're not out there saying, here's the persuasion.
It's not about persuasion anymore, Steve, right?
Both sides are about turning out their armies.
That's right. Turn out your base.
We have an army. You have an army. You try to manipulate your things for your army. We get that. That's fine. We're going to try over here. And you hear the minority leader say it out loud. He literally talks about this, and these are in terms of wars, right? There has to be, and I'm an optimist. I just really believe that both sides are, the faster they fall into the abyss and mutually behaving badly, the seeds of the middle grow. And the middle, as I've made clear, is not about simply being in the middle because you don't want to take a position. It's in framing every conflict, every disagreement with the underlying context that we're seeking resolution. We're not seeking to hate each other.
We're seeking to actually unify. Correct. We need to unify behind the best ideas and the best leaders. And we have a system that doesn't allow us to do that, which is why we're both working so hard on.
This is about citizen recognition, not about politician recognition, because the citizens will follow. I mean, the politicians will follow. And that's why it's the independent voter project. It's not the independent candidate project. This
Right.
is about empowering and allowing
The voter.
independent voters who
Yeah.
are predisposed by virtue of their choice not to join a party to try to judge each event, each policy issue, and each candidate on their merits.
On its own merits.
That's what distinguishes
whether it's the best idea or not.
Right.
Yes. Yes.
And those of us who are members of political parties, right? I'm still a Democrat, and there's a strong cadre of people would probably prefer I'm not, who are Democrats, right? But
Right.
they by definition, when you choose to affiliate or express a preference, you're saying there's a signal that can come from a messenger, and that I'm going to be predisposed to believe, rather than the message purely. An
Right.
independent voter
Yeah.
has, by definition, said the message is the medium, and I'm indifferent to who the messenger is. Right? It's natural for people to get to a place where they trust certain messengers, distrust other messengers. Our conversation earlier about the behind the scenes, and I encourage everybody to go and look at the IVN "This is how it works" story.
Oh, how it really works that I
How
wrote
it really
about the
works.
wealth tax. Yeah.
Wealth tax, exactly.
Yeah.
And you'll see what's being teed up to be voted on in November isn't anything remotely close to what's being publicly discussed. And then when you you peel it back and you see who are the interest groups behind promoting it, who are the interest groups opposing it, it all makes sense. But you got to know how the sausage was made, which now gets made before it gets presented to the public, as opposed to, and this is the downside of the initiative process. It's it's a yin and a yang. It's good and a bad. I think it's good overall that we had it, but we're now living in an era where the initiative process, because of the money and the barriers to entry, is dominated by special interests. On the other hand, we're turning to the initiative process to reform the reform. So I don't want to throw the initiative process out, right?
No.
I didn't stretch the imagination, but we need to just simply be aware of how and who is busy trying to manipulate it, just like they would manipulate the legislature. Nobody's surprised by the notion that there are lobbying efforts and efforts to manipulate legislative work product.
That's that's part of the
they
part of the water,
should recognize that the same
but
thing
this
happens.
is too.
Initiative, correct.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's just leave it there. It's wonderful to see you.
Likewise.
Have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you all again. Make sure you follow Independent Voter Podcast on Spotify or on Apple or on any place that you get your podcasts, and come to ivn.us to read all of our news stories for the week. This is the Independent Voter Podcast signing off. Thank you for listening.
This is the Independent Voter Podcast, sponsored by the Independent Voter Project and produced by OLAS Media. Remember, you can always find the Independent Voter Podcast or the How It Really Works series at ivn.us. Follow and subscribe at olasmedia.com.
OLAS Media.